But right about now, it's time for Business 360. This is where we get to discuss matters that are affecting the nation. And of course, we're looking at it from the economic point of view and also the well-being of the citizens of Zambia. And today in studio, I'm being joined by Mr. Sidney Mwamba, Executive Director for Policy Monitoring and Research. And of course, we're going to be discussing the causes of high prices on commodities in Zambia. Mr. Mwamba, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, and you're most welcome.
I was actually buzzing your phone throughout, just hoping that we could have this discussion.
Well, it's good that but I'm here.
Yes, indeed you are. Now, just to start with, let's help us understand what when we talk about commodities. Yeah, where do commodities stand in our lives?
Well, commodities are actually, whether it's a primary material or if it's a raw material, they play an important part of our lives in terms of making sure that we are capable of conducting our daily lives. Commodities are of various types. So you would talk of commodities like, for example, petroleum products. Yes. You talk about commodities like for example, Zambia, you talk about copper. You talk about, at a lower scale, you talk about gold. You talk about also agricultural products, commodities. Several of them, you talk about probably maize, which is our staple food crop. Yeah. And so when you look at all these, they are an integral part of how they affect our daily lives in terms of looking at how we center around our way of lives. And these indirectly, they've got an influence in terms of how costly we are going to live within society, because they play an important role in the various supply chain systems. And so you can't run away from understanding the dynamics centering around commodities. Okay.
Let's also look at Zambia's commodity market. How does it look like?
Well, because if you look at major commodities for Zambia, you may realize that for mega commodities, we basically an import-centered country. So commodities that are quite very essential in driving our economy, most of those we are basically importing. So you talk about petroleum products, for example, issues also to do with the fertilizer. And of course, on the other side, we also have our very own commodities like copper, and of course, agricultural products, maize, wheat, and of course, soybeans and so on. All these are actually critical in terms of centering how the Zambian economy would flourish, because if you look critically on the Zambian economy, in terms of the frontier, Zambia basically is an import-centered economy. So you find that most of these important raw materials that are quite important in running most of these value chains, we are basically importing these aspects. So it is important that there's a trade balance or a balance in terms of what you are importing and what you are also exporting. So, and these ultimately would make you understand how the dynamics of your costs in terms of running your welfare will actually be affected.
We've seen a number of commodities in Zambia have a high pricing, constantly skyrocketing. But before we get into details, I would want to understand what causes commodity prices to just rise.
Well, first and foremost, you must be able to understand that the commodities itself, depending on how important the commodity is in influencing economic activities it places a particular value. And so the nature of the commodity in itself and it will actually exacerbate forces of supply and demand. And so, for example, if you look at petroleum products, we are not the only ones that are basically using these petroleum products. Again, the geopolitical environment will also affect the pricing of these commodities. For example, depending on where you are getting these commodities, the cost of these commodities will actually be high depending on where it lands and from where it has been imported. Apart from that, the macroeconomic fundamentals of the country at the prevailing environment are also very critical. For example, you would talk about issues of exchange rate, issues of the strength of your economy and all those. These are also quite critical in influencing the cost of these commodities at import. And of course, we cannot throw out also the issues in terms of the effect on external shocks in terms of the global environment. So you find that because you are basically sometimes importing these commodities, and so what basically happens is that you have no control over, because these are quoted in foreign exchange. For example, whenever you are importing either fertilizer or petroleum products, you will actually use the medium of exchanges is basically the United States dollars. So you find that the exchange rate, the kwacha to dollar will actually influence how much the pricing of that commodity will actually reflect. Apart from that, you would also realize that for local commodities, for example, agricultural products, the pricing is basically determined by the level of demand and supply. But this is also linked to the efficiency in the production cycle. So, for example, we cannot be talking about issues of, if we talk about issues of productivity, let's talk about production in the maize subsector. So you realize that instead of actualizing our potential of probably maybe 10 to 11 metric tons per hectare, or for most of the maize hybrids, you realize that you are basically getting around 2 tons or even below 2 tons per hectare. As of the last year's cropping season, the crop focus results indicated that we actually had an average yield of 1.8 metric tons per hectare. That is way low productivity to be able to influence price reduction. So we require that. Efficiency simply means that in a small area you can be able to produce so much. And so even when we talk of government interventions, when they intervene by way of providing subsidies to small-scale farmers, if the ideal situation means that these farmers are capable of producing maybe even an average of 4 metric tons or 5 metric tons per hectare, we should be talking of double or triple of the national output in terms of maize production. But now that's not really the case. So all these factors play an important, get to affect the cost of commodities on the market.
Okay. Now we know that obviously like you have highlighted, there are a number of reasons as to why we see high prices. But what I would also want to understand is when we look at it from our local commodities, not international, because obviously there's the aspect of the exchange rate. But when we bring it back to local commodities, there has been a very skyrocketing increase, especially in maybe the staple food. One thing that a lot are asking, and obviously the reason as to why it's making airwaves, is not knowing what's causing this particular hike. So maybe you can explain on that one. How is it that we're still experiencing, high pricing on this local commodity?
Yeah, this is very true. I'll give you an example that last year, in comparison to this year, we have had, in terms of the increase of the cost of food, we have almost like 12% increase. But now the idea is, you may need to understand that in the production value chain, in terms of the cost factors that get into production, first of all, I did mention that we are an import-dependent country.
Yes.
First thing first, you realize that most of our fertilizer, despite us having the nitrogen chemicals of Zambia, which is basically just producing D-compound.
Yes.
Of course, now we do have the United, the newly formed company, yes. which is producing more of D-compound as well, and I'm sure they should also begin to produce few tons of urea and so on. Majority of the fertilizers that we are basically using is basically imported. Now, you should be able to understand that the Russia-Ukraine war has actually impacted so negatively on the pricing of fertilizer prices, in that some of the raw materials that are basically used in the production of fertilizer, yes, are also basically used in the production of war weapons, okay, ammunitions and so on and so forth. So so there's this demand for most of the chemicals that are used in the production of fertilizer. So, but also there has been some disruptions as well. The export routes, for example, Ukraine, in terms of the export routes, most of their export routes sometimes have been cut off and so on and so forth. You are aware that Russia actually even pulled out recently of the grain deal. Now, apart from that disruption in terms of the fertilizers, what we seem to be able to understand is that these same commodities, yes, they are also affected by the happenings in the international market. So whenever, for example, our macroeconomic fundamentals are affected, for example, if we have our kwacha getting to be affected against major currencies, that also begins to be the case. So, and you realize that last year, most of our fertilizer prices actually shot up. We could have been buying fertilizer in the other season somewhere around 500 to 600, but that shot up. You could actually buy fertilizer around 800, 850, and so on and so forth. So that simply means that the question is, who is going to pay this price now? So the price is basically passed on to the consumer. Okay? Especially that if your productivity, if the efficiency of producing these commodities is not better, okay, then it means that all these inefficiencies, which are basically costs, because you have to recover, they must be passed on to the consumer. So that's one of the major reasons. But of course, we should also be able to understand that Zambia, basically, where we are sitting, our market structure now simply means that we are surrounded by countries that are also in their demand of the same agricultural commodities. So, for example, you can't throw out the aspect of smuggling into Mozambique, Malawi. These are countries that were actually affected by severe floods. Okay, and most of their food production was basically affected. Similarly, also you have got the Congo DR market, and of course, even part of East Africa, they are also looking up to the same commodities in terms of feeding them. So the only way that we could, so this ultimately, because the laws of demand and supply gets to interact and ultimately will be able to fix the price. But the only way that we could fix this cost of probably the staple food crop, which is our maize meal, is basically to be able to look at policies that will allow more private sector participation, okay? Where we could encourage commercial farmers to get on board and produce more maize. Where we could actually diversify our farming systems by ensuring that we actually, even during off season, we do some winter maize production. Okay, and this is possible. But apart from that, the issues of reforming our agriculture is also key in terms of, for example, like what is happening now, that government envisions to move away from just looking at the farmer input support program, but transforming it and putting it under the Comprehensive Agriculture Transformation Program, where this FISIP is basically going to be enhanced and to allow it to be much more encompassing and allow the private sectors players to play their role in terms of supporting the agricultural sector, and of course improving the efficiency in terms of production. This, when farmers know that this is a business, okay, then they will be able to work hard and ensure that they do things correctly. The other aspect also will be to look at issues of provision of enhanced extension services to the farmers. Currently, I think we still have a big gap in terms of farmer to extension ratio. Yes. So once that is looked at, which government is doing, then the next aspect will be to look at what technologies can we use in terms of provision of extension services. We can provide, the government intends to provide e-extension services and increase the scope in terms of information flow, and of course the mobility of as well of these extension officers to be able to run through some of the important agricultural practices with the farmers, so that we could improve our farming practices and ultimately increase our productivity. Once the productivity is high, okay, it's automatic. The price of goods and services, or the price of these raw materials, are basically going to come down. So it's the productivity in terms of producing more per unit area that is going to raise, that is going to reduce the cost of these important commodities such as maize and ultimately maize meal, which we all see as an important food crop. But apart from that, it is important that we begin to diversify our diets. Okay, there is an agenda that we need to be able to diversify our cropping system by ensuring that we have, I think, rice is also another important cereal that could actually be able to supplement food on the table. Apart from that, there are also Irish potatoes. These can actually, if harnessed well, that's another industry that can actually harness the food diversity, and of course improve the nutrition security. Even that's why sometimes when we say that we are nutritionally hungry, it's because of the level of the food diversity that we take in terms of the nutrients. Yeah.
Okay. You mentioning of rice and of course the Irish potatoes. Why is it that there's been so much imbalance? We are mostly depending on the meal side and not also looking at the other, produce that we can actually depend on. I know that rice has been there, but it's not so much as talked about or as wanted as we cry for maize, because obviously when we look at issues of people exporting rice, people exporting Irish potatoes, it doesn't bring so much attention as that of someone exporting Millenium.
Well, I'll tell you that you've gone to Soweto and bought Nakonde rice. That Nakonde rice is basically coming from Tanzania.
From Tanzania, yes.
And the production is basically just done in the basins along the road. Of course, we understand Tanzania has got 2 rain seasons within a year. And so that allows them to be able to produce the rice within these small dumbos.
Yeah.
But we also have plenty of land in most of our flood plains. For example, in Luapula we can do that.
Yeah.
In Luapula province we can do that. In parts of Muchinga we can also do that along the Chambeshi area. We can do that all over many parts of Western province. We can do that along the Zambezi. What is required is to have a concerted will to say this is how we are going to do it. These are the measures and strategies we are taking in order for us to be able to improve the productivity for these crops, including the Irish potatoes. Apart from us having these Irish potatoes, of course, we know that there are quite a number of some few companies that are basically producing and supplying Irish potatoes like Biabamba, but that's not still very much enough to cover our market.
Yes.
Because at the same time, we are having quite much of the quantities of potatoes coming in from Tanzania, and we are buying them. You buy the red potatoes.
Yes.
Okay? Those potatoes are basically coming from Tanzania, and they are being grown by small-scale farmers. So we can do it. I think the idea is to try and introduce some of these strategies at small scale level, allow them to produce but produce them in quantities that can allow them to sell and allow them also to maintain their nutrition security.
Okay. So as we are talking about some of the agriculture issues, of course, there's also the aspect of energy shortages. How do these also impact the commodity prices in Zambia?
Well, you will realize that, for example, let's take some steps backwards. In 2015, you realize what really happened when we had the severe droughts and our energy sector was badly hit. You should be able to know that our energy sector is basically water dependent, it's hydro. And so with that lack of diversification in the energy sector, we suffered a setback. So you realize that industries had to be rationing power. Agricultural, the agricultural sector itself, those that are producing wheat actually suffered setbacks. For those also, including those that are basically working, okay? And as well as in normal households, we all suffered setbacks. Now, what did that simply mean? It meant that for the short period that I'm going to supply this power, okay, in order for me to survive, okay, I need to raise the cost of the products that I'm basically going to sell. So ultimately, that raised the commodity prices or a number of products coming from these industries. And so energy plays a very critical role. It's basically an important enabler to any development. So once it gets affected, then it simply means that gains in the agricultural sector, gains in the mining sector, gains in tourism, all these are going to be affected. There's no tourist who will be happy to go to a lodge where they have no power, for nearly for 12 hours. Okay? But ultimately, for them also, if they are going to supply power using probably a generator, then that simply means that the cost of tourism for us as a country will certainly become high, and ultimately that will affect the number of inflows in terms of tourists that will come through to the country. So you realize that during that period, a number of sectors actually recorded reduced growth. So energy plays a very critical role, and it is very important that I think going forward, I think you realize that now there has been a direction to sort of go green by ensuring that we diversify our energy sector, do a lot of energy mix in terms of putting up more solar plants, okay, encouraging maybe for cooking purposes, issues of using maybe LPG and so on and so forth. So otherwise, in the absence of stable supply of energy, that's very, very critical. So we require stable, good infrastructure in the energy sector, and that's why there should be more investments and continuous investment with response to industry needs.
You mentioned something about tourists, and that brought the question as to also how commodity pricing, high commodity pricing, also affects investors.
Yeah,
especially the foreign investors.
Yes. So basically, an investor will basically look at the issues of how the commodity market is structured, and the structure of the commodity market will determine whether these investors are ready to come in and invest. For example, if the structure is quite robust to allow more private sector investments, for example, recently, like in the petroleum sector, you've seen that we now have quite a number of players coming on board in terms of provision of petroleum products after the repurposing of Indeni and government policy of moving away from the importation of crude oil and direct government in the procurement. So you realize that investors have basically come on board to be able to invest in the petroleum sector and offer this service. So it's about the market dynamics.
Yes.
And the issue of demand and supply will also actually play a critical role in the investors coming on board. For example, there is no investor who would come and say, no, I want to invest in the production of tobacco if the tobacco market outside there is not actually that robust. So the issue of market is actually quite an important aspect in terms of putting or purposing a particular commodity to investments.
Okay. How can we stabilize the commodity prices? Is there a way that this could be dealt with? Because obviously we as a country are looking at bringing our economy back to stability, where it's stable, where we can actually gain investors' confidence, and where we can actually be able to have enough foreign exchange, which is something that we need as a country. But how then can we work around the commodity prices?
Okay, I think the first thing is that you are aware of where we are coming from. I think we are very much sure that we did we are coming from a set of events that basically affected our economy.
Yes.
The major aspect basically is that of COVID-19. From COVID-19, we entered into the which basically now triggered even the issue, triggered and compounded the issues of the debt for the country, where in 2020 we actually even defaulted on one of the Eurobond bullet payment. So what it is that it is important now that we basically look at some of these issues very critically. We are aware, you know that government recently there was a debt restructuring with bilateral lenders, and they are also in discussion with the private creditors for the 6.8 billion US dollars. I think a clear picture in terms of how the picture is going to be very clear, especially once the other 6.8 billion US dollars has been restructured. As we speak now, it is important that to bring most of these commodity prices to a stable level, first of all, you require to have stable macroeconomic fundamentals. Of course, we do have stabilized macroeconomic fundamentals. For example, I think for some time, the inflation has been running at single-digit value. However, I think what we need to do now is to look at policies that are going to stimulate investments, policies that are going to stimulate production. And so this is the time when government could offer incentives. But of course, you are aware, in last year's budget, government did provide a number of incentives to the private sector. Particularly the mining sector did receive quite a number of incentives, which I may not be able to touch here. But apart from that, I did mention about some of the policy reviews that are going on in terms of the National Agriculture Investment Plan, which is basically more or less like the National Agriculture Investment Plan 2, NAIP 2, but now called Comprehensive Agriculture Transformation Program. Once this is done, it is poised that we can improve the efficiency and productivity in the sector. And once that is done, only then should we be able to expect that if we have increased productivity, we should be able to cut on the cost of rising prices on major foodstuffs. The other aspect also is increasing. Once we begin to see an increased or better climate in the mining sector, for example, increased production in the mining sector, that will also mean that we are going to have more foreign exchange in the country, and that simply means that we can be able to have disposable income. So the central aspect that we should be able to talk about here is production. Our local production needs to be highly enhanced and ensure that we increase the efficiency in terms of how much we should be able to produce per unit area, especially in the agricultural sector. But of course, we are not just going to talk about the agriculture sector, mining sector. We still need to provide again some incentives to the tourism sector so that we could be able to attract more tourists, and ultimately the more resources we have, the more we can be able to rechannel these same resources to increase our local production, because it's these same resources that are basically going to to go towards provision of incentives and provision of subsidies, for example, in the agricultural sector. So it's a cycle, and so this circular flow of resources or money is important in our economy, and we should be able to ensure that it's harnessed in a much more efficient way, in a physical way that we stick to what we have planned, and we should be able to get there.
That is on a country level, but let's also look at it from a household level. Because staple food, obviously, if anything happens to the Millenium, definitely people will talk. And this is something that most of the citizens are failing to understand. So how then can they maybe just cope with the current prices, or not even cope? How can they deal with the current prices on the commodities, especially when it comes to important commodities such as fuel itself on a household level, as well as the staple food?
Okay. You know, you realize that at the household level, there are a number of strategies that we basically employ. So, for example, in the aspects of fuel prices, okay, I would give you an example of what basically happens in Europe. We see a number of vehicles parked when you're moving in the trains. Okay. What basically puts you only need a car when it is a serious necessity. Okay. If you know that you could be able to reduce the cost of transport, especially by cutting off unnecessary movements on fuel, you could as well, looking at the way you've been living, you could as well moderate the way you are moving. Sometimes some of the unnecessary movements we make basically just becomes a cost and a drain to our resources. On the other hand, in terms of how to moderate on the issues of food, of course that's a little tricky because on the Zambian front, you and I, we all want to have shima for lunch, and probably in the evening we could have lunch. We could have shima with something. So I earlier on talked about food diversification.
Yes.
So that's another area. I think if you could be able to have something other than shima in the evening, especially in the evening. That's one aspect you could moderate yourself on the aspect of the cost. Of course, we do understand that it's also another cost that you are taking there, but ultimately you could do a win-win situation in terms of if I buy this and if I buy midday meal. If, for example, you take 2 bags of midday meal per month, you could measure the cost of you eating rice in the evening against using that. Will that be able to economically mimic your spending at home or your cost of living? But I think these are basically cyclic events. I think we've been seeing that the cost of Millenium, it has been increasing actually year in, year out. The only thing is that probably it could have increased at a slight pace than we did not anticipate. But ultimately also like I mentioned about the issues of demand and supply. And I also did mention about the cost of production in terms of what had gone in last year and what the cost of buying this commodity. Okay, both from FRA, which FRA is offering, and as well as that from what the private sector is also offering. Actually, it's almost quite highly competitive, because what you may be able to realize is that within the region, we are one of the countries that basically had some sort of bumper harvest. And so all these other countries are also basically looking upon Zambia in terms of supply and so on and so forth.
Yes.
But even when you put all these restrictions, okay, it's not it's a little tricky to say that you can monitor every trade in terms of all the corners of the country. So not every maize that was produced will actually be bought by Food Reserve Agency.
Yes.
In order for them to intervene by ensuring that they provide some strategic intervention. That's not really the case, because the private sector actually also bought,
Yes.
such as millers and other strategic organizations that would buy and look at speculations and then sell the commodity later.
Yes.
For example, because our white maize is actually non-GMO, and they are just countries. For example, South Africa at some point would actually just want non-GMO maize from Zambia, and somebody could actually export that at a very high price. You know, they are speculative. Sometimes they are market speculations.
Yes.
And such things do happen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Indeed, they do. Your final remarks when it comes to, obviously, as we close, when it comes to the commodity prices, what are we expecting? Are we expecting to see a slight change? According to the research, obviously, are we expecting to see a slight change? And in change, is it going to be a downwards, or we're still expecting prices to continue going high?
Well, that's a very tricky question to answer, because markets currently markets are a little volatile, and you cannot predict or fix the demand and supply. These and we are in a liberalized economy where the laws of demand and supply actually take precedence. So we can only say that looking at the policy change in terms of what is going on, okay, in the agricultural sector, the sooner we move, the better in terms of how we are going to increase our productivity, and that is what ultimately is going to shape the future of our commodity prices. With regards to issues of maybe petroleum products, there is an idea that this will also depend on the stability and strength of our local currency, and hopefully we hope that after the debt restructuring deal is complete, it is likely that we might get a much more stronger kwacha and stable in terms of its performance against major currencies, and that will ultimately impact positively onto some of the foodstuffs, not just mealie meal, but also there are a number of foodstuffs that we basically consume that are basically imported from South Africa and many other countries. On the other front also is that so the issue also to do with that monthly pricing. So the idea will only be that we look towards the stability of the oil markets. Of course, the Russia-Ukraine war has basically impacted negatively on the issues of petroleum products, and also, of course, a number of these commodities.
Yeah.
So the stability of these events will actually mean that we should be able to get back on a stable and better front in order for the cost of living to be cushioned. But it requires concerted efforts. You and me and everyone else.
Yeah.
Every Zambian need to play a part. We need to. You need to play your role. I need to play my role, and everyone else have to play their role in order for us to get where we envision to reach. Yeah.
Well, Mr. Mwamba, thank you so much for joining us on the Business Day. It's really been a pleasure having you in studio with us.
Oh, thank you.
Dear viewers, you have been watching the Business Day, and of course our topic of discussion was the cause of commodity prices, high commodity prices in Zambia, and I was joined in studio by Mr. Sydney Mwamba, Executive Director for PMRC, and that is what we were discussing. Unfortunately, we've come to the end of today's edition of the Business Day. I have been your host, Rebecca Gombe. Thank you so much for staying tuned. Stay blessed and continue watching Millenium TV.